Welcome to the very first episode of The Femsplainers. I'm Danielle Crittenden.
And I'm Christina Hoff-Summers.
And we are very excited to bring you, in the coming episodes, some of the most interesting, fabulous women on the planet.
And occasional mansplainers.
Occasionally.
There will be men.
There will be men, and there will also be cocktails. We've made it a policy here at Femsplainers that to get a really good conversation going, we should be doing this over cocktails. And each of our guests will recommend their own favorite, but we're starting with this first one with Christina's favorite, which is a Kir Royale.
Yes, my Kir Royale.
What goes into your Kir Royale, Christina?
Well, a classic Kir Royale would be creme de cassis and sparkling white wine. It could be champagne or Prosecco. But I like what's called a Kir Imperial, which is with Chambord.
What is Chambord?
It's a raspberry sort of base drink, but it has Madagascar vanilla and cognac and honey.
Oh, wow. Okay, well, I think on social I'm going to post the recipe for the Kir Royale, but we should try the Imperial next time. And what, you serve cold and in Paris?
Yes, it's just a drink not well understood outside Paris.
Well, we'll get to know it better, but we also need to get to know each other. And we thought for this first episode, before we bring on new Femsplainers, you'd want to get to know each other and how we, in fact, came to be Femsplainers. And we have to also figure out what Femsplaining really means.
What is a Femsplainer? I think it's just going to emerge. We will be the definition, for better or worse. But maybe we should say how we met.
This is pretty funny. This was years ago.
I don't remember the year.
You know what? I don't think if we remembered the year, it's like a lady's age.
Yes,
I don't think we should admit it. But we were both at that time. We had both written books of similar themes about women and feminism, and we had both belonged to a sort of new organization based in Washington,
the IWF,
the Independent Women's Forum, that then was forming in reaction to some of the more sort of official and entrenched feminist groups like the National Women's Organization, or National Organization for Women. And we'd never met, but we were going to debate Betty Friedan.
And two other people. Maybe there was another person on our team. I have no idea who that was.
I just remember we were meeting. Betty Friedan, of course, is the founder of modern feminism. Right? She wrote The Feminine Mystique in the late 50s, and that just broke open the doors for what is called the second wave of feminism.
I reviewed it a few years ago and went back to read it.
Yeah.
I came away I liked her. But we fought with her that day.
Well, she was terrifying. I mean, she was the founder of modern feminism. And we were told, we met in a studio in New York for PBS. It was public television.
Right.
At quite early, like at 8 in the morning.
Yes, it was 8 in the morning. And you took something out of your purse, and I couldn't believe it.
It was very nerve-wracking. We hadn't met each other.
But we
were on the same team.
I knew we were going to be friends.
Well, I had this rule. Before I did, I used to be very nervous about going on television. And especially before Betty Friedan, I was really flipping out. And so I had this rule that I would take one shot of vodka before going on.
She had an elegant little flash. And then I thought, okay. This is what we're doing.
Not more than one shot. And I took it out of my purse and I poured it into a empty coffee cup. And I realized as I was doing it, you were looking at me as if to say, oh my gosh, is this the person I'm going to be debating feminism with Betty Friedan? At which point you took out a cigarette.
No, I didn't take it. I was not a smoker, but I was a situational smoker.
Yeah. And then we knew we'd be friends. So
we smoked and drank at 8 a.m. and then went and had this debate.
And she got so mad at us. And I can't even remember.
Didn't she almost lunge at you?
Yeah, we were on podiums facing each other. And honestly, it also must be said that she had become, in old age, as we would later find out, quite volatile and over the top.
Yeah.
And I went on to meet her subsequently. She invited me to a class she taught at George Washington. And I was sort of impressed, given how much she had disliked us at the time.
She was volatile all her life. I think she had anger management issues. Like once she was debating Phyllis Schlafly, and then suddenly out of nowhere she said, "You're a witch, and I'd like to burn you at the stake."
That's just sisterhood, you know.
Yes, sisterhood is powerful.
But during that debate, and honestly, I can't remember what happened, but she did literally lunge across the podium at me.
I don't know
And
what
then,
you said that set her off.
I don't know, but it was pretty funny. But then ever since then, you and I have been on a kind of side of barricades till I kind of dropped out of it. But you've been fighting on.
I never wanted to fight. You know, I don't know what, I just thought there should be a correction. And in fact, it didn't come out in that debate with Betty Friedan, but I agreed with a lot. There's a lot of good things in that book. I mean, not the part about comparing housewives to inmates in concentration camps. But she loved men. She loved,
I think she loved motherhood too.
yes.
Like she saw it as integral
Yeah.
to, like, what I think you and I came at it from different ways. And I want to hear, we came at it in similar ways from different backgrounds. But
Right.
tell me, you wrote Who Stole Feminism in 1994. It was published then.
That is correct.
Tell me, I'm sorry, I shouldn't use dates, but yes, that's when it was published. We'll get to mine. But tell me what led you to publish, because that was a very seminal and maybe the first, I want to say it's almost like the first, and I'm going to call it feminist criticism of second wave feminism, that in the 90s, and I really believe starting with your book, thereabouts, that everything that had happened in the 60s and 70s and 80s, as you said, seemed to need a correction.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about that. Talk about what you were doing then and why you felt compelled to write.
Well, I came to write the book specifically because I had been a professor on a ship called Semester at Sea. Have you ever heard of that?
Who is a professor on a ship?
I know.
Like, what degree do you get? Like
I already had tenure. I wouldn't have
Caribbean
I just saw,
PhD.
I sent in my vita. It was in the New York Review of Books, and I thought, go around the world and teach philosophy of religion, and go to mosques, and go to ashrams, and then teach. I don't know. I taught.
How long were you at sea? Like, did you just go indefinitely around?
You went around the world.
Wow.
My son was 3. David was 3. I had imagined it would be a ship full of babysitters, and none of them wanted to babysit. So he just tagged along.
Where was Fred, your husband?
He couldn't come. There was a family member was ill. He had to take care of her, and he was not able to come. So he met us in Bombay and stayed for a while.
So
I'm there
on
with
this
a 3-year-old.
Ship?
And
Philosophy?
yes, teaching philosophy. I had never sat in on other professors' courses before, even though I'd been teaching in the university for a long time. You don't sit in on each other's courses, but on the ship you did. And I was a little surprised to find that there were several professors who were Marxists, self-described Marxists. When we would go I remember we visited Yugoslavia, it was still intact. It was celebrated as the great success of Marxist-Leninism or something. The country's about to implode, but we had to celebrate it according to these professors. But there was a feminist theorist, or maybe feminist psychologist, her name was Carla, let's just say that, from a college in Ithaca. And she was teaching radical theory to the young women on the ship. And I noticed, and I would hear her lectures, and they were very harsh. And the young women were getting angrier and angrier.
Harsh in what way?
Just describing the state of women, including the women on the ship. Now, these are 18, 19-year-old girls, and the ship was about 65%, 70% female, whose parents were sending them on a trip around the world. They're not an oppressed class. They don't really match the profile you associate with oppression. But many of them became convinced. And what really bothered me, we would come into ports. We came into Cadiz, Spain. It was one of the first ports. And those students, there were trips. You could go to Andalusia and you could see these magnificent ruins and magnificent churches and the Alhambra is there. And instead, they stayed in Cadiz and went and visited bridal shops to deconstruct the condition of women in Spain. I mean, okay, fine. I guess you could learn something from bridal shops, but
You learned that they had really beautifully made veils.
oh my goodness, the lace, Spanish lace. If you go to Barcelona, the lace makers, there's a big difference between handmade lace and machine-made lace, and they make it by hand. And that's why, yes, there is a
so
huge
they would
bridal.
go in and hector?
Well, they
bridal
didn't
shop.
understand. They just went to, they didn't understand. And it also was a women's art form. There were so many, there were sympathetic ways to approach it, but this was not approach sympathetic. This was a simplified oppressor and oppressed dynamic, and they were looking for that in everything. So there was just something a little fanatical about it. And they weren't visiting the Alhambra. So all that. So anyway, long story short, there were these Marxists. So I came back and wrote a little essay called Professor at Sea and sent it to The Atlantic. And
Which was then like a monthly magazine at that time.
Yes. And a very wonderful editor wrote me, Michael Curtis, and said, I can't really use this essay, but the way you talk about the feminists, it's interesting, and you're doing it from a feminist perspective. I want to hear more, and commissioned me to write a piece on the state of feminist philosophy and women's studies. And so that was the beginning. That would eventually turn into Who Stole Feminism?
I think one of the things that when you talk about this, that when you mention the Marxism, that there was always, and I guess with any movement, and I'm sure we'll see it emerge, if it's not already with Me Too, there's the populist movement that strikes a chord, even you could say with Trump. There's the popular movement that strikes a chord, and then within it is a radical core that, whether it's innate to the movement or the idea or is just goes along with movements, but Marxism of that time, the 60s and 70s, was in many, many forms throughout, especially universities.
Still is.
Still, well, they're behind. But that's what, when I was reading feminist texts, in high school, there were kind of the Nora Ephrons and the Gloria Steinems, right, and even Betty Friedan, even if she went kind of over the
Betty
top,
Friedan said that
her,
a woman has to be the master of her life, and like a man, that you have to be not simply the other. You're not going to be second-class citizens anymore,
right,
and all of that was,
and that's inspirational,
yes.
Right?
And they took a strong stand against male bullies, about male chauvinism.
Right. Or destiny. Female destiny did not have to be in a box. But what was odd about, as the sort of feminist Marxists and the people that you encountered, and as women's studies, I guess maybe from the beginning was radical but became more radicalized, it was really taking Marxism and pulling out...
crossing out class and putting gender.
Yeah. Men are now the oppressors. Women are the proletariat. Women, whatever, we are innately oppressed, and the only way we can win is to actually overthrow men, right, which, when you think about it, kind of crazy, especially if you like men or want to get along with men.
Yeah, because you might end up sleeping with the enemy.
The world must be peopled.
The world must be peopled.
So,
who said that? I forget.
Well,
we'll think
not Oscar Wilde.
No.
Not Oscar Wilde. Oh, so you came to it as the kind of...
I was an accidental critic of feminism, because I think if Michael Curtis hadn't asked me to write that article, I might not have pursued it. I mean, I'd had some disagreements with some feminist theorists in the American Philosophical Association, but...
Oh, I'd love to be at those coffee parties.
Oh, yeah.
Versus the women of the Philosophical
Society of Women in Philosophy. Do you know what happened? I went there and gave a paper because the chair of my department had asked me to teach feminist theory. I thought, fine, I'm a feminist, I'm a theorist. Let's order the text.
Let's bring that on.
Bring it on. And I thought the readings would be organized as most philosophy courses I had taught, where you'd read, the pros and cons of a particular position, and there would be point, counterpoint. This was a kind of, all the readings were mutually reinforcing, and they did adopt a very radical, I don't know what it was, they called it socialist feminist. It was that was popular at the time, and it was a combination of Marxism and radical feminism. And this was very popular in the American Philosophical Association, well, not in the APA itself, but in the Society of Women in Philosophy. So I went and I thought, they're confused. I'll just give a paper and show why the unintended consequences don't look to be too good, and women don't really want this, and the theory of false consciousness to explain why the rest of us are in a state of ignorance seems a little bit matronizing. So I went and gave this paper, and usually if you go to the APA.
Wait, you just said matronizing.
Yes.
That's great instead of patronizing.
Yeah. Well, for the femsplainers.
Right.
Anyway, I went there, and they usually, if you go to this group, this professional association of philosophers, it's rather unpleasant because people are just looking to find fault with what you say. I expected that. What I did not expect is while I was speaking, and they became aware that I was criticizing their theories, they started stamping their feet and hissing. I was excommunicated from a cult I didn't know existed.
Were you like just taken completely by surprise?
Yeah, I thought we'd go out for drinks. We didn't. Anyway, it made me mad because you can write crazy things, and there were really crazy things in these texts. I mean, I won't say. Oh, Alison Jagger, this philosopher, she's still at the University of Colorado. She had this book on feminism and politics and human nature. And she called for a violent revolution, on page 139. And I'm reading it and thinking, is she serious? So I wanted to question these silly things that were said.
You were serious, so earnest.
Yes, I was earnest. And I thought that if you pointed out logical flaws,
you go, wow,
the problem was solved. The problem was not solved.
Good question.
And, these theories, they're still there. They've changed now and evolved into intersectionality. But it's still a fairly pessimistic, negative. It views our society as just hopelessly compromised by prejudice and bigotry and oppression. And, those things are there. But what's wrong with just classical democratic liberalism and reform? That seems the best way to approach it. But that entire tradition in those areas now of feminist theory, well, that may have changed in philosophy. I haven't kept up with it. But in women's studies and in gender studies, you'll still find a lot of textbooks that take a very radical perspective and hardline and negative. And
right. Well, I think I had a similar experience, completely different background. I, unlike you, have avoided all forms of academia because I didn't even go to college. I grew up in a newspaper family. And the minute I graduated from my public high school, I was working in a newspaper.
Girl reporter.
I was a girl reporter. I knew that's what I wanted to do. I didn't see the point. I mean, stupidly in retrospect, I regret it in many ways, but I just was so keen to dive into the world. And what is interesting is that my mother I have 4 parents, mother, father, stepfather, stepmother, or had. All of them were in the newspaper business. And in fact, all of them worked at the same newspaper. So the women in my life were working in newspapers.
Right.
And my mother had worked, she did not go to college. She went right into, they had like junior Argonaut programs for reporters in the 50s. And yes, as a woman, you might be sort of put into the lifestyle.
Women's page. But
you were really working closely in these newsrooms. And it wasn't glamorous to be a reporter. I was thinking about it the other day and realized my parents were like firemen or policemen, sort of the working class. Like it was not a glamorous job. If you could use words the way someone else may be able to lift a body over their shoulder, like then you'd go into reporting. I mean, the New York Times was like the gods of Olympia. Like that was maybe prestigious.
Yeah, but even there, I bet a lot of the reporters came up through reporting, not through cultural studies at Oberlin. Right. No, you came from, and so you were, and it was then you were, it was a sort of very working and middle class environment, and I grew up. So my book, What Our Mothers Didn't Tell Us, was published. You had to look down. Did you forget?
Yeah.
I know.
I can't even remember what I've written.
I know.
It was published in 2000, but it was a product of these years. I began writing as a reporter, as coming from this family where it had never occurred to me, and sort of post that 70s feminism where we all agreed, you could do whatever you want. Uh-huh. You didn't have to get married. You didn't have to have babies. You could realize your greatest dreams. I went right into the newspapers, and I began, aside from chasing ambulances and following murders, I got interested in following some of the women's issues of the day. And this was in Toronto, where I grew up, Toronto, Canada. And I remember I started to go to some of these women's demonstrations. I sort of embedded myself with a feminist group.
Did they burn bras?
No, that
I don't
was
think
so 1970.
Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, they never really burned bras. They.
Oh, I think there was like one photograph.
Yeah, I think that was
bras.
a stunt. They maybe some girdles were put in a trash bin.
And I like my bras. Why would I?
Yeah, I know.
Gosh, why would I?
Please join the Femsplainers.
Yes, subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or your favorite podcast hangout.
And follow us on Instagram at the Femsplainer Podcast.
And find the Femsplainers on Facebook and Twitter at Femsplainers.
And learn all about us at femsplainers.com. Thank you.
Yeah, Femsplainer. Anyway, I started to go to these rallies, and I embedded myself with this quite radical group, and I went to their meetings, and I was interested because I'm like you. I'm like, yeah, women, yeah, we're gonna
let's do it.
Let's do
and
it.
Girl culture
And things. And I remember being at a meeting where the woman, this is like pre-internet, so the leader of the group brought out a big piece of poster board and began drawing circles, like banks in the middle, and then an arrow, and then like military things, and then another arrow, and then like men. And it was like, you're going, wait, you're just randomly drawing those lines. There's no actual solid data but she was getting everybody in the room all geared up to go and do a demonstration that resulted in a bunch of these radical women going to the heart of Toronto's financial center and doing a sit-in at lunch hour, like at a very busy time in the intersection, a sit-in in the main intersection, and the police, it was just like a play, right? They sit down, they start chanting.
What did they want? Did they have a goal?
They thought the financial world oppressed women. And what was funny is I'm standing there and I'm watching these women sit in the middle of the streetcar tracks and the police paddy wagons pulling up. And, them screaming and sort of
Canadian police, they come with squirt guns. And
No, they just go like, come on, can you get into the wagon,
And
please?
she says, okay.
So they pulled her in, start pulling them in, and it was, they got their drama. But my eyes were drawn to all the working women of the financial sector on their lunch hour walking past, just looking at these women going, what are you doing? Why are you saying we're oppressed?
Okay, now wait a minute. I'm going to defend those crazy ladies sitting in the street.
Go.
Because it's possible that if they didn't do what they did, then it might be 20 years later, the women in the financial district became aware that there were problems.
Right. No, not getting around that. But at that time, it just seemed
it didn't have it was over the top.
And kind of sentimental.
But people tell me, don't you think we need a radical vanguard? And you know what? We did. But at a certain point, you overcome that and you become the mainstream. Well, but what happened is the radical has become the mean in the academy. I don't think it's true in society at large, but in the academy, those women sitting there, they've not changed. They have the same mindset.
That's right. Like it's what we've seen happen even with the Republican Party, or not that we're going to get into politics so much of that kind here, but
we can get into politics. Although I don't know my politics anymore. I'm politically homeless.
Who does?
Yeah.
But when an idea or program is successful, like Reaganism was successful, the women's second wave feminist movement was successful, there are, I guess, inevitably people, and usually of that generation, who they don't come up with another idea. They don't go, oh, well, that's great. We've won this battle. So now we have to look at the new challenges that our success has brought. And I think maybe that's what you and I were saying is, look, we've got so much success, especially someone like me growing up thinking, naively, I'm sure, but there was nothing that was going to stop me.
Right.
And it wasn't, I was especially privileged. It was just that was how it felt at the time. So now
they're like still knocking down doors that are already open,
Right.
And you hear the discourse on the campus. It's as though we never had two major waves of feminism. Mm-hmm. And most of the big breakthroughs actually came in the late 60s, early 70s, because that's when the laws changed.
Right.
Because you did have women out in the streets, but at that time you had a powerful coalition of Republican and Democratic women working with men on both sides of the aisle who transformed women's lives through court cases that went to the Supreme Court, these signature achievements. But they were in the late 60s, early 70s, when conservative and liberal women and some men worked together.
Right.
And that's something we've lost today because it's as if...
Well, maybe not. And before we get to Me Too,
Yeah, well, Me
because
Too could have brought it back.
I think Me Too is going to prove, I think, very similar. Do you remember what they called the aha movement in the 60s, 70s?
The click.
The click. It wasn't the aha moment, it was a click. And that was when a wife was doing the dishes and the husband walked in and said, like, "Where's my sandwich?" And at that moment, that was the moment she threw the dish towel down and walked out of the house. And that was her click moment.
I saw some of that. And I was in college in the 70s and babysitting. And I saw some of these angry women having their clicks, click moments. But it looked terrible to me because I was babysitting little kids and they were so angry. And the husband seemed frightened and diminished.
Well, I think just bewildered, like,
yeah,
always been this way.
Yeah.
Like, what did I do? But what our mothers didn't tell us was my attempt, because I saw the disconnect between like these radicals in the intersection and what we'd achieved. But I also felt like, okay, but now we have new problems. And what I felt in my 20s, early 20s, is marriage was totally like, if you were an ambitious woman, it would be embarrassing to get married. Like, you didn't need marriage, children, like, forget about
children.
Like, maybe when you're 50.
Oh, no, I think that I did. I think for my mother was very feminist, and she was a bit negative about children.
Right. It was very negative. To my mom's credit, she never was. But it was around you, so you just thought that the most important thing was you focus on your career. Career. That was what was going to make you happy. And, the rest of the stuff, family, marriage, motherhood, just put that to the side, think about that later. And as we saw and have seen, that proved catastrophic for a lot of women in my generation. And I
waited too long.
Right. I mean, things have changed a lot now. We can talk about that. But there, you just saw like the woman who was in her late 30s, who had never gotten married and never had children, and what that was doing to her, and the regrets. And, in the end, a job, no matter how great, is still a job. But
well, I would say, there are some people that are not meant to have kids. They have, they make perfectly good lives for themselves. But if you are the sort of person that should have kids, which is most of us, and fortunately I realized that by the time I was 30 or so, I thought, maybe I should do this,
Mm-hmm.
And once I did, it was like the best thing I'd ever done. And nothing prepared me for how much I loved this little creature in my arms.
And that moment where you realize, like, all this thing that men and women are the same.
Yeah. No, because you carry it for 9 months, and there are these hormones surging in your body.
Can I be graphic for just a minute?
Yes,
not too graphic.
The men, if you're listening, don't listen.
Just the moment it was really brought home to me that men and women were different, and you couldn't just give birth, drop the kid, go back to work, even if you had the best child care worked out in the world. It's not the man's shirt that is getting soaked with milk every 4 hours. You are suddenly this biological creature, hostage, if you want to put it that way, to your biology. So all your most egalitarian ideas in the world go out the window when you're the one.
I know, and they drag.
It's got the sonar.
It seems
on.
to me to be so different. And I had a protectiveness and an obsessiveness about his well-being. My son David, my little son, and his father loved him very dearly, very, very good father. But he wasn't. It just was different. Mothering is different from fathering.
Okay, well, we have to talk about mothering. Different.
And we have to talk about the fact that I don't think men should be there the moment you have the baby.
Okay, well,
do you disagree? I don't know. I just think that it's, there's. I think why not keep a little bit of mystery and keep something alive in your relationship? I mean, let me put it this way. I think too many married people, after a few years, the woman sort of becomes, either they become roommates or worse, she becomes his mother. It's better to be his mistress, be your husband's mistress. And I'm just not sure that this whole, being right there that moment with you is I would rather have my girlfriends or
your mother.
Yeah, my mother gets hysterical.
Well, I feel you can, the first time I went through it, and I had that sense because, it's pretty graphic, and I don't think men generally like this thing, and there was a reason they sat in the waiting room with cigars.
Yeah, that's better.
But it's also possible that you can do artful things with blankets and have the men only look at your face as it's writhing in pain. And it's nice to have him there, and it's that moment once the baby's out, and he's taken it.
True.
There's a kind of special moment that
I know, I agree. And actually, Fred was there when David was born. It was a cesarean. He didn't see anything, and there was
I didn't see anything either.
I didn't, thank God.
Thank God.
I actually prefer the idea of cesareans. I mean, it's a kind of, you have to have babies the way they cave women. God. Anyway, won't get into that. But have a cesarean. I would prefer that. And it's presided over by great drugs, and you just, it's kind of...
I think also, by the way, drugs, greatest thing ever for giving birth.
For giving birth.
For
having fun on a weekend.
Christina is not advocating that.
No.
Christina, okay, so let's just go back to what we were talking about. So this whole thing of why we're here, why we're femsplaining, why we're doing this podcast.
Because I think, we should be able to talk about men and women outside of some rigid little ideology rigged up in 1969 or 70 by neurotics. And there were a lot of kind of crazy neurotics that wrote the
ideologues, right?
Ideologues is what I really meant. They're the same. And they blend. So why can't we just think of them? And that's what I want to have people like, Caitlin Flanagan or Barry Weiss or all sorts of women we'll have on who think outside the constraints of contemporary feminism. Now, there are things we learn from feminism. I don't want to be, in the state of denial, and I won't learn from them because you can, and I have learned from them. But my God, they're so rigid, and they're so It's not everybody, but so many that I meet when I go to campuses, they don't want to be friends. I mean, why not? I want to be friends with them. I want to find out what they think and argue with them. I'm not closed. What about having a podcast where women can just, we bring in women, we can talk about things without being, rigidly adhering to a set of rules we didn't write.
I think that's the thing, and it goes back to what we were talking about, that we both began our careers grappling with the limits of what had happened and how in the second wave of feminism and how it had kind of ossified and rigidified and become ideological. But there were really, with all of its successes, there were, of course, new challenges. And I think what I want to do on this podcast is explore a lot of those new challenges. And when I look out over this landscape, and now as the mother of 3 children, 2 of them in their 20s, 1 still in high school, I just look out upon a landscape of baffling confusion. I don't see a rigid, unless they're in college, I don't see sort of a rigid feminist movement governing things. I see cultural influences. I see, them struggling to figure out, why do I have to pay for a date? My son, my daughter, why isn't he paying for it? There are so many little micro things, but it all comes from this idea that we don't really know the roles of men and women are supposed to be today, and then we'll deny roles.
The exciting thing, in a way, is that maybe we're in a period of radical freedom where we're going to redefine this kind of something dreamt by Simone de Beauvoir, this sort of self-definition. But if it's going to be, a generational definition, then I would say don't appeal to, these ideologues who set these ideas and who were, hostile to conventional masculinity and femininity. Maybe there are good things about gender roles. I know that if you don't fit the role, it was horrifying, stultifying to be forced. But maybe the purpose of, liberation is to free people who don't wish to do it. But what about those of us who enjoy being conventionally feminine and like masculine men? And, I think the new generation, as they go through this, they shouldn't assume that androgyny is the ideal. It sounds, very worthy. But do you remember Pat on Saturday Night Live? It was you don't remember Pat?
I don't remember Pat.
I think she was even Canadian.
Oh,
I don't remember her.
Probably. But I like, what phase of Saturday Night Live? Like, what was her shtick?
She was a gender neutral. Well, no one knew if Pat was a male or a female, and the whole joke was to try to figure out what Pat is. And she would come, and she would, didn't talk, and she had the way she was dressed, and she kind of seemed like a girl. You couldn't tell. Anyway, they just had fun with that. But I don't see that as an ideal to aspire to. Although Pat was a very nice person, I'd like her as a friend. So no more intolerance for androgynous people or, whatever the sexual subcultures. Here's the thing. I want the liberation. I'm from the 60s,
You're such a hippie girl.
I'm a hippie chick. And it was about liberation and acceptance. So what I see today is, there's kind of more liberation for sexual, subcultures and all that. But not a lot of acceptance. Too many rules, too many call-outs, too many, just taking people and trying to ruin them and all. What is that?
I was talking to my daughter, who's 16, last night, B.
Oh my God, the B.
B.
And B. Charming.
And B was, I asked her, because I knew we were going to talk about this today. So I asked her, I said, what are some of the problems and things that you think about for your generation of women? And I said, do you feel like you can do anything? Like, that's how I grew up.
Yeah.
And I'm not, again, I was from a very middle class background. And she said, I do feel like I can do anything, but that's because I'm privileged. So we talked about that a little, and it was a little bit like she felt that this idea of the American dream, anybody who can do anything, was not true to all women. I thought that was really interesting and true.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that the gap of women, the fact that marriage and the most stable marriages are now an elite thing, that has become more pronounced than ever.
I know.
And then I asked her sort of about her ambitions, and she was funny. She said she felt that there was a little too much pressure to change the world. That what if you just wanted to be normal and happy and pursue what interested you, and maybe it wasn't going to change the world. So I think that was probably a little bit of an elite school pressure thing. But I thought that was interesting. As this generation of women come of age, there seems to be more extraordinary pressure on them to be extraordinary.
Well, here's the good thing about that. This is a very competent young woman, B, president of her 10th grade class.
Yeah.
And I'm not surprised. She's a natural leader. And I love hearing this from her because I do think that's a new awareness, even though it's fun to, you make fun of all this, like privilege, check your privilege and all that. But there's a reality to it. But then instead of just pointless protests, they protested the factual feminists. They protested me at Lewis and Clark College. So pointless. Use that energy to actually improve the world. And one way to improve it and to address what B was talking about is that what's happened to people. We talk about wanting marriages and believing in fathers, but there's so many kids who can't form families, young men who can't make a living. And if a young man can't make a living, he's, going to have a hard time. He can have kids, but he probably won't get married.
Right.
And so we're looking at that and that phenomenon moving into the middle class, the white middle class. At first we saw it in the black working class and lower class, and then it moved into the white lower and working class. And it's moving up into the middle class, both black and white. And what do we do about that? And that's why when I wrote the book, The War on Boys, I think it's very important to invest in male education. And we're not doing it. And I don't do that because it's anti-feminist. I do it because it's pro-humanity.
Well, the man question and the challenges facing modern men is definitely something we're going to femsplain about. And we look forward to it. We look forward to hosting so many interesting women and men. Yes, we're going to have some honorary mansplainers. And we welcome you. We want to talk to you. We want to hear from you. We want to hear what you want us to talk about. We want to hear your points of view. And you can find us all over social media.
And on Instagram and, I don't know, on Twitter?
Yes, we're on Twitter. We're on Twitter.
You're in charge of all.
All right, I'm in charge of that. So follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Femsplainers. Follow us on Instagram at Femsplainers Podcast. Most important is subscribe to us on iTunes or Google or
your whatever
your favorite podcast site. And also you can find out more about us, more about our guests on our website, femsplainers.com. But the important thing is that we want to hear from you. We want to engage. And cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.